make a country prosperous.
Murray Rothbard, who of course was not only an economist and a political philosopher, but also an American historian, was always bothered by the fact that while there were always some good economists, always some good political philosophers, there were no historians who knew any economics, who in fact were culpably ignorant of economics, those who weren't just active proponents of evil. So, Tom, here we have you, a historian who is an economist too, and that's, I think, what gives such life to your books. I mean, your books are bestsellers. I urge anybody who some of the few Americans who haven't read Tom Woods, one of Tom Woods' books, be sure to take a look at Meltdown, because he's such an extraordinary writer, and he brings to his study of history and economics a tremendous life that just makes these books a pleasure to read. You start reading it, and you're through to the end before you know what's happened to you, and you know a whole lot more. And you certainly know a whole lot more than you're hearing in the media. So here, Tom, we have this work of both history and economics, Meltdown, where you're telling us what happened in the Great Depression, what happened with Hoover and Roosevelt. But what about the fact that another alarming thing that we hear about the old days, and I'm afraid for the current days, is it's the conventional wisdom that World War II cured the Depression. That it was the magnificence of, I guess, killing all the unemployed and totally socializing the economy that somehow made everything okay.
Yeah, I mean, this one, of course, Bob Higgs is the guy who's done so much work on it. That is something that I address in there, because you're right, there is plenty of history in here, in addition to talking about the bailouts and talking about gold and money and all the things people need to know about, business cycles and stuff. I talk about all the panics of the 19th century, because people say, well, look, there wasn't a Fed in the 19th century. How can you blame those things on the Fed? So I go and explain what was causing these panics in the 19th century. And then, given that another argument is that even by some of the sort of good guys, who understand FDR wasn't so good, is that, World War II finally got us out of the Depression. I mean, there are a couple of sort of crude versions of this. I mean, one is that just the mere act of producing guns and bombs put people to work, and that ended the Depression. I think the Krugman argument is slightly less crude, believe it or not. I think it's simply that this sort of just jump-started the process of people spending again. But what I'm showing in here is really just building on what Bob Higgs has done, which is, first to sort of make a logical case that, obviously, if you're preparing for war and you're taxing the 60% of the population to support the 40% of the population that's in the armed forces or civilian employees of the armed forces or in the so-called defense industry, that doesn't create wealth. I mean, all you're doing is just subsidizing one part of the population at the expense of another, and the part that you're subsidizing is producing goods that consumers can't even use. So this obviously can't, this doesn't really mean much. Secondly, Bob Higgs points out that, presumably I don't need to draw you a diagram to show what happens when, 11 million people are drafted into the armed forces. Unemployment does go down. I will concede this. If I lined them all up and shot them, that would solve the unemployment problem. But that's not how a healthy economy solves it. But then beyond that, he says that the statistics on which this claim is based, you look at the national income accounting statistics during these years, and it looks like, hey, we've got a big boom. But for one thing, this shows the shortcomings of GDP, because it includes government spending, as if government spending is a contribution to rather than a predation upon the economy. If the government spends $200 on a $120 item, that's marked as a $200 added to GDP. I mean, this is obviously a misleading statistic, but beyond that, if you're even going to try to aggregate all these purchases over the course of a year, the point is that the purchases have to be meaningful in some sense. In other words, when people buy and sell freely, they generate market prices. But if the government just simply says, well, the price of X is going to be $10, well, that's not a freely generated price. It's a meaningless, arbitrary price. So, for instance, if the government said, from now on, the price of eggs is $1 an egg, and we, the government, are going to purchase 10 million eggs. So 10 million eggs times $1 an egg gives us $10 million added to GDP. In what way is that a meaningful measurement, such as it is, of the state of the economy? It's a completely arbitrary figure. And given how how deeply and how systemically controlled the U.S. economy was during the war. So many of these prices are arbitrary prices generated by the government for its purchases. So therefore, you add up all these arbitrary prices, and then you have spillover effects of this arbitrariness throughout the rest of the economy. And the result is you have one gigantic arbitrary number that doesn't actually mean anything. And finally, I think both Higgs and veteran Galloway point out that if all this is true, that just the mere act of just crazy spending creates prosperity, then 1946 should have been the worst year on record. You know, we're bringing all these men home. We're not spending all this money overseas anymore. Well, this should have been terrible depression, and we were warned about this by some Keynesians. Well, we're going to sink into depression. And if you look at the GDP figures, 1946 is one of the worst years on record. But if you actually look at, the statistics that matter, the private economy, how much is being produced, employment, it's the single most productive, explosively productive year in American history because finally some semblance of normal economic order is restored.
Tom Woods, thanks so much for writing this book. Talk about a book that we need at this exact moment in time. Ladies and gentlemen, read Meltdown, read Tom's other books. You can get them at Mises.org. They're all for sale, too, at LewRockwell.com. Look at Tom's archive on LewRockwell.com. At the bottom of his archives lists some of his best-selling books. Click on those links, buy them. Every one of these books is wonderful, whether Tom is writing about American history, about the truths about American history that you're not supposed to know. And this book is all about that. This book is about both economic truth and historical truth that's hidden by the current regime, by its friends in the media, by its friends in academia. But Tom Woods, you're telling the truth, and boy, it's truth that we need to hear right now about what's happened to our country, what's happened to the whole Western world, why it didn't have to happen, why it doesn't have to happen in the future. So if you want to be armed against all the liars and the propagandists that surround most of us every single day from Washington and all the other power centers in the U.S., read Meltdown. Let me give you the subtitle, too. Meltdown, a free market look at why the stock market collapsed, the economy tanked, and government bailouts will make things worse. It's from Regnery, and I predict, as with other Tom Woods books, soon on the New York Times bestseller list, too. Tom Woods, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Lew.
You've been listening to The Lew Rockwell Show. Produced by LewRockwell.com, the best-read libertarian website in the world. Thanks for listening.